Your lecturer is Dr. Mark W. Musey. Dr. Musey is the W.J. Millard Professor of Religious Studies and Director of the Asian Studies Program at Rhodes College. A member of the American Academy of Religion, he previously held teaching positions at Harvard College and Harvard Divinity School. Professor Musey's effective and motivational teaching style earned him the Clarence Day Award for Outstanding Teaching, Rhodes College's highest faculty honor.
Several years ago, I rented a movie on DVD that sounded very interesting. With great anticipation, I took it home and turned it on. One of the extra features on this film was a commentary by the director and the producer, who conversed between themselves about various aspects of the film as it was being played on screen. This little dialogue was fine, and at first I found it interesting to learn why the director took a certain angle on this particular shot or why this scene was juxtaposed to that one. Initially, I thought the conversation was just part of the opening of the film, and that after a few minutes, the director and producer would become silent and let the movie proceed without the incessant commentary. What I soon realized, however, was that the DVD was stuck in this commentarial mode. No matter what I tried, I couldn't turn it off. The only way to watch the film at all was to view it as these two individuals were discussing it. Naturally, I couldn't enjoy the movie because I couldn't really hear it over the foregrounded conversation. Later, I realized that this defective DVD had actually provided me with a profound insight into the operation of my own mind. My whole life was like a movie playing out before me, but I couldn't understand or enjoy it because in my head were voices commenting on everything as it happened. Even worse, unlike the DVD, my mind was full of voices, not just a dialogue between two reasonably intelligent persons. It was like a committee meeting with a dozen points of view, all vying to be heard. And just like the DVD, I couldn't turn the commentary off. This, I suggest, is how our minds function most of the time, generating a constant swirl of remarks and judgments that create a barrier of words and images that separate us from our very lives. We end up attending more to the internal cacophony than we do to the world around us. I call this mental condition mindlessness. Not because the mind is uninvolved, but because we find it difficult to be mindful or attentive to the experiences of our lives. The very dynamics that lead to mindlessness, I contend, can be gently redirected through meditation to cultivate the quality of mindfulness and to develop the mind in ways that will be conducive to our happiness and the happiness of others. That is what this course is about. Mind is a notoriously elusive concept. We all have an intuitive idea about what we mean by that word, but trying to define it concretely seems almost impossible. Throughout the centuries, theologians, philosophers, psychologists, and other thinkers have offered various ways of conceiving of the mind and trying to bring some specificity to the notion. Mind has been identified or associated with such functions as consciousness, thought, perception, memory, emotion, willing, reasoning, and imagination, and with various combinations thereof. None of these proposals, needless to say, has gained universal acceptance. For our purposes, these many fine distinctions need not detain us. In this course, the mind will refer to all of these mental processes. At times, we'll focus on one or two or three to the exclusion of others, but we will always think of the mind as a society, to use an image suggested by cognitive scientist Marvin Minsky. A society comprised of all of these processes. In short, we'll remain content with a rather vague conception of the mind. As we proceed, we'll begin to see the value of allowing this concept to remain broad and inclusive. With this general definition as our basis, let us now consider how we experience our minds. Perhaps the first and most obvious thing we can say is that we ordinarily think of our minds as our own. My mind is mine. It doesn't belong to you or to anyone else. Likewise, I suspect you experience your mind in the same way, as something belonging to you and no one else. No one else, apparently, has access to our minds. No one really knows what goes on in our minds, unless we tell them. No one can read our minds, but they may infer our mental states by becoming familiar with facial expressions or other gestures that coordinate with particular forms of our subjectivity. Scientists may be able to analyze certain brain activity using sophisticated imaging techniques, but they cannot perceive what our minds are thinking or feeling. While our minds may, in fact, be controlled by demonic beings, alien life forms, or sentient machines, as in the film The Matrix, our ordinary mental experience does not suggest this. We basically think of ourselves in control of our own thought processes. Our minds are, in fact, our most private domains. So important are they that we tend to identify with our minds by thinking of them as the center of our personality. Most people will more readily regard their minds, or some aspect of it, such as intellect or consciousness, as the locus of their true or real selves, rather than, say, their bodies. To such people, mind isn't just what they possess, it is who they are. Yet, we usually experience our minds as somehow connected to our bodies. As I stand here in my body, or perhaps as a body, I experience my mind as functioning within the same space my body occupies. Even more specifically, my mind seems to work within the same space occupied by my head, suggesting a close relation between my mind and my brain. When I move my body to another location, my mind seems to follow it. Wherever my body goes, my mind appears to go with it. This is ordinary experience, of course. If I were under the influence of mystical ecstasy or single malt whiskey, my experience of the relationship between body and mind might be altered. But even the fact that a dram of whiskey can affect the functioning of my mind in this way attests to an intimate relationship between these two components of my being. However, specifying the exact nature of that relationship has bedeviled thinkers for millennia. Despite the obvious importance that we accord the mind and the intimacy it has with our physical natures, we don't really understand it or use it very well. Most of us simply have not taken the time to observe the operation of our mind. We pay some attention to the content of our mind, but we have little awareness of how our mind functions. Consider for a moment where your thoughts come from. Do you know why you have particular thoughts or thoughts that continuously recur? Can you explain why one moment you're contemplating the sobering fact that you may die at any minute, and 2 seconds later you're wondering what's on TV tonight? Most of us cannot give satisfactory answers to these questions. Our faltering ability to provide good answers derives from inattentiveness. In general, we pay about as much attention to our minds as we do to the rest of our lives, which is to say, of course, not very much. Reflect on the passage of an average day in your life. For how much of those 24 hours are you really there? If you're like most of us, your daily life is essentially governed by routine. You wake up, you get dressed, you have breakfast, you go to work, you do whatever it is you do, and your existence is driven along pretty much by well-established habits. The great value of these habits is that they free our minds to do other things. It's not necessary to go through a lengthy intellectual process of trying to decide whether or not to take a shower or reflecting on the pros and cons of brushing our teeth. We just do these things without having to expend precious energy trying to make up our minds. Unfortunately, the freedom such routines afford the mind is not well used. If they find a moment when complete attentiveness to the present is not demanded, our minds tend to gravitate to one of two places, either the past or the future. If this claim does not have the ring of truth for you, I invite you to perform this experiment at your convenience. Simply stop whatever you're doing, sit quietly in a chair, and allow your mind to go wherever it wishes. Try to pay attention to the flow of your thinking. If you're like the vast majority of human beings, you will soon find yourself dwelling on a past event, perhaps a conversation you had that didn't go as well as you would have liked, or a future event that you're anticipating, like what's for dinner tonight. Your thoughts may even alternate between past and future, but they will tend to avoid the present as much as possible. If you pay attention to your ordinary thought processes, you will discover that you probably spend very little time living in the present. Even when we find ourselves attending to the present, we may discover that what our minds churn out is fairly worthless. Most of us are constantly making instantaneous judgments about what we experience. Imagine sitting in a committee meeting. Somehow you've avoided drifting into the past or racing ahead to the future, and you're actually paying attention to what is being said. Well, to some extent, if you watch your mind carefully, you'll probably note that it's only half attentive, if that much. The rest of the time, it's feverishly assessing and evaluating not just the content of what's being said, but the most trivial, insignificant things about how it's said and by whom. You may find yourself looking at the new haircut of the woman across the table and thinking, it doesn't fit her face at all. You may notice one of the men wearing a tie. It seems to go well with his eyes. Then you observe that the person running the meeting has a raspy voice that you're always finding irritating. Suddenly, you become aware that you haven't said anything in a while, and you desperately try to think of something that will impress the others or at least make them laugh. If you allow these trains of thought to continue, you may find them leading to other thoughts and judgments. Your difficulty in coming up with something intelligent to say brings you back to that familiar anxiety you have about not being as competent as others. To avoid that unpleasant thought, you focus on someone else in the room. Strangely, seeing the woman with the odd haircut temporarily soothed your fears of incompetence. At least you don't look hideous. Or wait, do you? Well, you certainly don't have an irritating voice, and you can be glad for that. You quietly sneak a glance at your watch, wondering how much longer you're going to have to endure this ordeal. The whole meeting has become irritating. Wonder what's on TV tonight. As this scenario suggests, we're not ordinarily in control of our minds, despite what we may care to think. We can't turn them off. And we can't always make them do what we want. Judgments, thoughts, and emotions seem to arise unbidden and often unwelcome. Rather than we controlling our minds seem to control us, compelling us, driving us, urging us in the directions it deems fit. The image I often conjure when I ponder this situation derives from my childhood, when I attended the annual Heart of Texas Fair and Rodeo. There I watched seemingly hapless cowboys strapped by a single hand to a bucking bronco or a wild bull and hanging on for dear life as the powerful animal was released into the arena. Years later, I came to think of my relationship to my mind in much the same way. I was like a hapless cowboy strapped to a potent beast of the mind and bound to go in the direction of its choosing and enduring the inevitable ups and downs of back-cracking bucks. Mindlessness comes at a very high cost. A cost that I hope you'll agree is too high. To put it in its most general terms, living with a mind that we don't know very well, that is often out of control and semi-conscious much of the time, causes us and others to suffer greatly, probably far more than we realize. The Buddha, an individual who knew the mind far better than most of us, put it this way: whatever an enemy might do to an enemy, or a foe to a foe, the ill-directed mind can do to you even worse. Is it any wonder we so frequently attempt to silence or alter our minds with drugs, amusements, or other forms of distractions? It's probably no coincidence that individuals who choose to end their lives by gunshot almost always put the bullet through their heads. Fortunately, most of us don't reach this mind-driven point of despair, but we nonetheless endure the consequences of an immensely powerful but unruly mind. We find ourselves entertaining thoughts that serve no wholesome value in our lives. We make snap judgments about individuals based on the slimmest and most trivial of evidence. We spin out falsehoods that we ourselves come to believe. We're constantly comparing ourselves to others, a practice that inevitably leads to pain, whether we measure up favorably or unfavorably. All of this and more drives us to lead frenzied lives, often on the verge of misery. The sense of dissatisfaction, of which we are more or less conscious at different times in our lives, impels us to find something, anything, to bring relief. Unfortunately, our minds have been conditioned to seek solutions to its torment in the most unhelpful ways. For most of us brought up in the modern West, we look for solace through intoxicating substances and entertainments, incredibly busy lives, over devotion to work, shopping and acquisition, and hours on the internet. Vast sectors of our entire culture have become refuges for individuals searching for ways to bring contentment to their lives. So far, I have never met a single individual who has professed to find genuine satisfaction in any of these ways. And yet, the search rages on. The beliefs that compel us to keep looking somewhere else for something to bring us relief are so common that we rarely consider that it might be time to try another approach. Rather than seek happiness through the usual ineffective and often counterproductive means, this course will offer you a different way. Practicing mindfulness is predicated on the conviction that it is not necessary to live at the mercy of an untamed mind. It's possible to cultivate a wholesome mind that will produce thoughts that contribute to our well-being and the well-being of the whole world. We can actually shape our mental functions in ways that will remove the frantic, driven, distracted, semi-conscious qualities from our lives. But it will not be easy. This conviction is founded on the belief that our minds are malleable realities. They're plastic, and they can be reshaped in ways that we choose. The mind, in other words, is a conditioned phenomenon. How did our minds get into this sorry state that many of us find them? Perhaps we were born with certain dispositions to act and think in particular ways. Many Hindus, Buddhists, and Jains think that karma, our thoughts, words, and deeds from previous lives, profoundly influences the mental states we have at birth. But you need not accept the theory of rebirth to accept the underlying principle of karma. Essentially, the idea of karma suggests that the way we are now is the consequence of the ways we have thought and acted up to this point. In short, we have been conditioned by ourselves and by others. Whether we believe the conditioning process began eons ago in former lifetimes, or whether it simply began in this lifetime, at birth, or even conception. The term conditioning is a very useful one for describing this process. Think of it in exactly the same way you might think of going to the gym for strength or aerobic conditioning. Each time you lift weights or walk the treadmill, your body responds in a way that makes it slightly easier to manage the same action a few days later. The more you train, the easier these actions become until they almost seem effortless. Gradually, over time, habitual strength and aerobic conditioning can significantly transform your body. The same process happens with the mind. Habitual thinking significantly determines what we think, feel, and perceive. The more we entertain a particular thought or a particular kind of thought, the more our minds are prone to generate thoughts of that nature. The process of mental conditioning is so powerful that it may seem at times that our whole cerebral function is entirely determined by the factors of our biological makeup or our upbringing. But in this course, I take the position that we have a small but extremely important capacity to redirect our minds in ways that allow us to recondition it. Our minds have been considerably influenced, but they are not completely destined by the past. To put this stance in traditional philosophical terms, we are largely determined, but we have a modicum of free will. But free will in this sense is not just a given. It's not just a feature of our makeup. Free will is something that we must exercise and develop. Without cultivation, we're vulnerable to losing the ability to act and think freely altogether. Ultimately, the goal of this course is to assist you to increase your freedom by practicing it. This course will be unlike most other courses you've ever taken, in which your mind is deliberately stimulated. Stimulating the mind is valuable for many things, but it is not what this course is about. This course is for people whose minds are overstimulated and need a respite from too much thinking. As the course title implies, our approach will be eminently practical. We will be less concerned with theory than practice. In this course, there will be homework and tests, but none of these things will be written. All work will be inscribed by and on your own life. The final grade for the course will be self-assessed, and only you will have access to it. The insights you gain will be principally those you discover on your own. There will be meditations and other exercises to do. You'll need to carve out a time and place to focus on them. For certain periods of time, you'll have to disregard the TV, the internet, the telephone, and other distractions. You'll learn to think of the mind not as the center of your personality, but as an instrument or tool that you can use for your happiness. Like any instrument, it's essential to learn how to use it properly and to practice using it until the skill becomes second nature. At first, like learning to play the piano or violin, rehearsing the motions will seem awkward and wooden. Over time, the artificiality of the practice will dissipate. Beginning with the next lecture, I'll introduce you to the concept of mindfulness. I'll tell you more about what mindfulness is and the sorts of benefits and advantages it confers. Then I'll tell you about the basic procedures for becoming more attentive to your mind and for redirecting your attention in ways that will engage you more fully with your life. I hope to remove any aura of exoticism or strangeness about these methods. They're nothing extraordinary. They are skills that anyone can develop. We'll discuss the simplest aspects of living: breathing, sensing, feeling, eating, walking, and standing. When we've covered the fundamental aspects of mindfulness practice, we'll work on more challenging things: cultivating compassion for ourselves and others, developing a life of generosity, accepting our mortality, and coping with physical pain, grief, and anger. We'll talk about how to be more mindful of your speech, your work, and even your driving. I cannot promise that listening to this course will make you happy or will improve the quality of your life. Whether or not it does is entirely up to you. I can say that throughout the ages, individuals who have seriously employed the very methods that we'll discuss have claimed to have discovered something deep and enriching by using them. The Buddha, who warned us earlier of the tremendously harmful potential of the undisciplined mind, also proclaimed the tremendous benefits of a mind well-trained. Whatever a mother, father, or other relative might do for you, the well-directed mind can do for you even better.